I knew this flight wouldn't be ordinary the moment I heard an exasperated screech pierce through the bustling airport lounge, a sound so shrill that even the overhead announcements seemed to stumble mid-sentence. It was a voice that demanded attention, a voice so infused with indignation that passengers paused mid-coffee sip to glance around in alarm. At the center of the commotion stood a woman in a wide-brimmed hat, tapping her foot at an impossible speed, her manicured nails drumming staccato beats against her overpriced suitcase. She was locked in an animated dispute with a harassed airline employee who looked more like she was bracing for a Category 5 hurricane than performing a routine boarding procedure. I'd never seen someone come so unhinged before even boarding a flight. And yet, there was a magnetic force in the way she carried herself, like she couldn't help but put on a show for the rest of us. For a moment, I found myself hoping that this was all just a weird performance art piece. Maybe she was a method actress preparing for a future role as entitled woman number one. But judging by the color steadily rising in her cheeks, this was no act. I was on my way to Vancouver for the first time in years, hoping to reconnect with my adult son and see if we could mend some fences. We'd grown distant after he moved west, and I figured a friendly in-person visit might do more than our stilted monthly phone calls. Admittedly, I was also looking forward to enjoying the comfort of first class, my first time splurging on something like that. I'd scrimped and saved for months, determined to give myself at least one flight experience that didn't involve cramped quarters and unappetizing snack boxes. From my vantage point at the lounge's corner, I could see the woman huffing and puffing as if the airline staff had committed some mortal sin by existing. Every time the employee tried to speak, she'd raise her voice an octave, drowning out any semblance of rational conversation. My eyes drifted over to the now-forming queue of first-class passengers. I inhaled a quiet breath of relief, thinking that the boarding process for those seats usually went more smoothly. That, at least, was part of the perk, right? But my relief was short-lived, because as soon as the woman noticed the line forming, she stomped over, ignoring the dirty looks and a few discreetly rolled eyes. She started picking people off visually like a hawk scouting prey. Perhaps she was trying to judge how many were ahead of her or who might try to stand in her way. I quietly prayed she wouldn't set her sights on me. In the old days, my temper might have flared at such behavior, but these days I prefer to keep my head low. I just want a calm flight, and hopefully some restful hours before confronting my complicated relationship with my son. Boarding was called in the usual order, families needing extra time, then first class. I approached the ticket scanner, relieved to be stepping away from the drama. As my pass was scanned and beeped acceptance, I heard the clang of suitcase wheels behind me. Sure enough, it was the same woman, her eyes narrowed, her eyebrows drawn in what could only be described as a perpetual scowl. She was muttering about incompetent airline staff and the nerve of some people. I stepped into the jet bridge, half expecting her to hound me right there, but she was too busy shaking a pointed finger in the face of the gate agent. At least for a moment, I was off her radar. But sometimes fortune isn't meant to last. When I found my seat, by the window, I stowed my carry-on and exhaled in contentment. Plush seats, a couple more inches of legroom, and a promise of a better meal than a bag of peanuts. I was about to sink into that cushion and say a quiet thanks to the universe when a voice, that voice, echoed from a few rows behind me. "Excuse me, excuse me," she shrieked, and though her tone was directed at the flight attendant, I felt it zapping my spine. "This is unacceptable." I specifically demanded an upgrade, and they said this flight was oversold in business and first class. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the flight attendant began. "We're fully booked up front, and the seats are assigned. Could you please?" The rest of her words were drowned out by the woman's ear-splitting groan. "Do you have any idea who I am? I'm an elite-tier traveler." She jabbed at her chest with a manicured finger so aggressively, I wondered if she might poke straight through her flamboyant blouse. "I spend thousands of dollars a year with this airline. I deserve a first-class seat. And I see plenty of people who don't look like they belong up here, if you know what I mean." My heart thudded as her gaze swept the cabin. Her eyes skimmed over an older couple to my right, a well-dressed man in his 30s, and then landed on me. She paused, a single eyebrow arching above the rim of her sunglasses. I turned to face the window, willing the plush seat to swallow me whole. I could feel her stare burrowing into the back of my head like a laser. I've been so excited about this flight, about the possibility of forging a better relationship with my son. In that moment, I realized that fate, or perhaps the odd cosmic sense of humor, had different plans for me. Ones involving an irate stranger who seemed determined to make everyone else miserable if she didn't get her way. And from the sound of it, her way was about to collide headlong with me. The flight attendant tried calming her down, voice gentle yet firm. "Ma'am, please take your assigned seat so we can finish boarding other passengers." Like a rattled hornet, the woman spun on her heel, scanning the seat numbers. Each time someone shifted or coughed, her glare snapped in that direction. I sank deeper into my seat, willing myself invisible. But her gaze found me anyway, as if she could smell that I was an easy target, an older woman traveling alone, perhaps not as practiced in confrontation. She marched up the aisle and stopped directly next to my seat. A whiff of strong perfume, something floral and overpowering, replaced the stale airplane air. Up close, I could see the tension in her jawline, the clench of her fists. "Excuse me," she said in a tone that suggested she was anything but polite. "I think there's been a mistake. This is my seat." My pulse kicked up a notch. I'd never been good at handling public scenes, and here I was, thrust into the middle of one. "I'm sorry, but I'm in two, and I managed. You might want to double-check your boarding pass." "I know my boarding pass. Thank you," she snapped, waving the piece of paper so close to my nose I could smell the ink. "And I specifically requested first class. I'm on an important trip, and it's crucial I arrive rested." She pointed at me with those lacquered, dagger-like nails. "Didn't your mother teach you any manners? You should do the right thing and let me have this seat. Clearly, you don't need it as much as I do." The audacity rendered me momentarily speechless. My mind whirled. Who did she think she was? And how did she jump to the conclusion that I didn't need, or perhaps didn't deserve, a comfortable seat I'd worked so long to afford? Rage bubbled in my chest, but I forced it down, reminding myself I was too old to engage in a spat with a stranger who was clearly spoiling for a fight. "Ma'am," the flight attendant interjected, voice still heartbreakingly calm. "Let's take a look at your ticket. The seat numbers in first class are all accounted for. If you—" The woman cut her off, brandishing her phone. "I have status. Do you see this? This airline emailed me an upgrade code, but your incompetent gate staff wouldn't let me use it. They said something about seat limitations. Now this nobody," she jabbed a finger in my direction, "is sitting in my seat. I will not be disrespected like this." I felt a flash of anger that nearly erased my usual passivity. Who was she calling a nobody? I might not be VIP status, but I was a paying customer who had every right to be there. Still, I swallowed hard and kept quiet, knowing the flight attendant had the authority to resolve this. The flight attendant, a tall woman named Beatrice judging by her name tag, took a breath. Her expression flickered with a kind of exasperated sympathy. "Ma'am, I understand you're upset, but there's no mistake with this passenger's seat. She's in 2A, in your—" Beatrice scanned the boarding pass the woman was still clutching. "Actually in 14C. 14C, she practically spat. "I can't possibly sit in economy. Do you know how cramped those seats are? I have a medical condition." A low murmur rippled through the cabin. Other first-class passengers were now openly staring. Across the aisle, a silver-haired couple exchanged baffled looks. In the row behind me, a business traveler sighed, shaking his head. We were all capturing the same show, and nobody seemed to like the performance. "Ma'am," Beatrice said, "if you have a documented medical condition, we could try to accommodate you in a seat with more legroom. Perhaps an exit row, if available. But first class is fully booked." "I'm sorry." The woman pressed her lips into a tight line. Then, with a sudden theatrical flourish, she clutched her chest. "I can't breathe," she gasped, though the sincerity was questionable at best. "I need space. Are you trying to put me in jeopardy?" At that point, the plane was nearly full, and the overhead bins were being snapped shut. Several more flight attendants began drifting toward our row, alerted by her raised voice. My heart raced. Now we had an audience of both flight staff and curious passengers. Some had their phones out, not exactly filming, but clearly prepared to if things escalated. Beatrice offered the woman a glass of water and tried to reason with her in hushed tones. It didn't help. The woman slapped the water away, and the plastic cup clattered to the floor, water splashing onto the carpet. A collective gasp spread like a wave through the cabin. "I'm not moving," she barked. "You hear me? I paid for an upgrade, and you gave my seat away to some random person. If you can't do your job, then get me the pilot." Or she faced me again, pointing a trembling finger. "You could do the honorable thing and get out of my seat. Isn't that what your generation does? You help those in need." My mouth fell open, stunned by the audacity. The nerve of dragging generations into this fiasco. I was about to retort when a sudden hush fell upon the cabin, broken only by the faint hiss of the air conditioner. Something had shifted in the woman's eyes, a mixture of desperation and fury. And for a split second, I almost felt sorry for her, almost. But then my better angels prevailed, reminding me that she was the architect of her own problem. She'd stormed aboard, insisting the world revolve around her. I took a steadying breath. "I'm sorry," I said carefully, "but this seat is mine. I'm not moving." Her shriek cut through the air again, even louder. "You'll regret this," she spat. "Mark my words, you'll all regret it." The meltdown was official. Heads were popping up from rows all around us, and the plane's entire crew looked torn between performing their safety duties and corralling this tornado of entitlement. My chest tightened. I knew this wouldn't end quietly, and I braced for the turbulence that would arrive even before we left the ground. The next few minutes were a blur of stern words and frantic gestures. The flight attendants valiantly tried to placate the woman while ensuring the rest of U.S. didn't bear the brunt of her wrath. After more back and forth and a tennis match, she finally agreed to relocate, though reluctantly would be an understatement. Before she stomped away, she leaned in close to my face, so close I could see flecks of mascara flaking beneath her eyes. "Don't get too comfortable," she hissed, her breath laced with mint gum. "You think you're so special sitting up here, but you'll see. Karma has a funny way of teaching lessons." She spun on her heel and trudged down the aisle, her suitcase wheels squeaking. I allowed myself a small sigh of relief. Maybe now we could get on with the flight. With the overhead bins closed and the flight attendants doing a final seatbelt check, we pushed back from the gate. I tried to settle into my seat, heart still thrumming. I glanced out the window, watching the ground crew shrink away as the plane maneuvered toward the runway. The entire fiasco lingered in my head like the aftertaste of a bitter pill. I reminded myself why I was making this trip, to see my son attempt to patch old wounds. Focus on that, I told myself. The last thing I wanted was to let this Karen overshadow my intentions. We took off smoothly, and soon the plane ascended into a blanket of clouds. Once we leveled out, the flight attendants started their service. I forced a polite smile, trying to hide any lingering nerves. Beatrice offered me a glass of champagne. I usually didn't drink so early in the day, but after that confrontation, I figured a small celebration of my own resilience wouldn't hurt. For a while, I managed to relax. The hum of the engines was oddly soothing, and I was just starting to let the tension ease from my shoulders when a commotion from behind the curtain dividing first class from economy drifted forward. A raised voice, followed by the unmistakable clip of that same shrill tone. My stomach flipped. Sure enough, it was her again, though now she was verbally sparring with a flight attendant in the economy section. I tried to block out the noise, shutting my eyes and focusing on my breathing. But eventually, the tension soared to a breaking point. A tall flight attendant, presumably a supervisor, appeared from behind the curtain. She whispered something to Beatrice, who then approached me and quietly apologized for any inconvenience. I could see the anxiety in her expression, the embarrassment. "We rarely have passengers like this," she murmured. "Thank you for being so patient." I nodded and offered a small, sympathetic smile. It wasn't her fault. but I could sense the crew bracing themselves for more turbulence of the human variety. After the meal service started, some kind of roasted chicken with potatoes, far better than the microwave fare in economy. I picked at my food, half-heartedly reading an in-flight magazine. The cabin lights dimmed, signaling a rest period for this mid-length flight. I leaned back, put on some soft music through my headphones, and tried to drift. Maybe I dozed off for 20 minutes, just enough for a disjointed dream of my son's childhood. In the dream, we were building a model airplane together on our living room floor, and he looked up at me with that bright-eyed curiosity I adored. We were younger, happier, free of grudges that would later wedge between us. My reverie was shattered by footsteps pounding up the aisle. They halted right by the first-class curtain. I peeked over the edge of my seat, removing one earbud. It was the woman again, hair disheveled, expression set in seething frustration. She was speaking in hushed, angry tones to the flight attendant stationed at the curtain. I couldn't catch every word, but phrases like "ruining my life," "need to speak to the pilot," and "do you know who I am?" trickled through. The flight attendant tried to quiet her, but she wouldn't budge. She was pointing toward first class with wild gestures, as if she planned to march right up to whoever had wronged her, which, in her mind, included me. I quickly slouched, attempting once again to become invisible. Suddenly, I heard my seat number slip from her lips. The woman in 2A, she's not qualified for first class. I bet she got her seat on miles or some cheap upgrade. This is a scandal. I felt my cheeks heat, anger stewing in my gut. That was it. I had put up with enough. The flight attendant at the curtain was blocking her from coming forward, but the shouting escalated. Passengers around me stirred, many lifting their heads to see what new drama was unfolding. The silver-haired couple across the aisle shot me looks of sympathy. One of them whispered, "I'm sorry you have to deal with this. Some people just can't handle not getting their way." I gave a curt nod. It was comforting to know others recognized the absurdity, but it didn't ease the knot in my stomach. I just wanted the flight to be over. By now, the woman's voice had become a twisted cocktail of righteous indignation and half-sobs. "I've never been treated so poorly," she cried. "I'll have every staff member on this plane fired. I'll sue." A uniformed pilot materialized from the cockpit, presumably responding to the uproar. With a commanding but calm presence, he tried ushering her away, explaining that her behavior could result in the flight being diverted, a threat that made everyone's stomach clench. She argued back, voice quivering with rage, but the pilot remained firm. He told her that if she didn't calm down and return to her seat, the authorities would meet her upon arrival. For a moment, I thought that might do it, that maybe she'd see sense. But the look on her face told me she was far from calm. She was cornered by reality, by rules that didn't bend for her convenience. And sometimes, people in that predicament act out worse than ever. I closed my eyes again, hoping to shut out the fiasco. It's just a few more hours, I reminded myself. A few more hours until I could escape this airborne circus and focus on my real reason for traveling. But as the plane droned on, I had a gnawing feeling in my gut that this ride still had a few more twists in store. As we started our descent, the tension was so thick you could slice it with a plastic airline knife. The pilot's announcement crackled through the overhead speakers, instructing everyone to prepare for landing. The seatbelt sign dinged on. Around the same time, the curtain between first class and economy parted, and the woman stomped forward with single-minded determination. She must have waited until the flight attendants were occupied with final checks to make her grand reappearance. I braced myself. Her face was flushed, eyes darting with the frantic energy of someone who decided to double down on bad behavior. She gripped the headrests on either side of the aisle, scanning the rows until her gaze locked on me. "You," she spat, striding forward despite the protest of a nearby attendant. "You robbed me of my rightful seat. Now I'm going to sit here, and you can deal with the consequences." She tried to plop herself into the empty flight attendant jump seat across from me, reserved for crew, of course. The flight attendant nearest her stood up from a crouched position, where she'd been checking seatbelts, and quickly intervened. "Ma'am, you can't sit there. That seat is for crew only during landing." The woman whirled on the attendant. Then she She jabbed a finger at me. Can move. I'm not going back to that sardine can in the back. The plane began to shudder slightly as the wheels extended, a gentle vibration that hinted we were close to the runway. Everyone's eyes were now either on the flight attendants, who were trying to secure the cabin, or on the woman, who refused to budge. As soon as the final approach began in earnest, the flight attendants had to take their jump seats, meaning there was precious little time to argue. One attendant, a tall man with a collected demeanor, said firmly, "We're landing in less than 2 minutes. Ma'am, you need to be seated in your assigned seat. This is not optional. It's federal law." Her expression twisted in fury. "Don't you dare talk to me about laws. I'm the victim here." She was nearly screaming over the roar of the engines. I was half certain the pilot would abort the landing or call for security mid-runway. But we were already locked into our descent, so everything played out in a surreal mixture of adrenaline and helplessness. Passengers around me gripped their armrests, uncertain of whether we'd have a last-minute fiasco in the aisle. Then, in a split-second decision, perhaps realizing she was seconds away from a forced removal or worse, she staggered to an open seat in the front row of economy, right behind the curtain. The occupant there had quickly volunteered to swap seats with her just to avoid a possible catastrophe. I caught a glimpse of the older woman who offered that seat. She looked both terrified and exhausted, but also exuded kindness, maybe just wanted to defuse the situation. At last, the plane touched down with a jarring bounce. Relief coursed through me. We had landed safely, meltdown or not. A wave of applause spread through the cabin, as if we'd narrowly avoided an in-flight disaster. If the Karen was annoyed by the cheers, she didn't show it. She just sat stiffly, arms folded, refusing to make eye contact. We taxied to the gate, and the seatbelt sign blinked off. Normally, this is the moment when everyone stands to retrieve their belongings. Today, though, nobody rushed into the aisle. It was as if we were all waiting to see what she would do. The flight crew made a pointed announcement that passengers were to remain seated until their row was called. Predictably, Karen sprang up immediately, ignoring any semblance of order. 2 uniformed officers from airport security entered the aircraft moments later, stepping aboard with polite but purposeful strides. You could feel the tension in the air, a collective finally, pulsing through the passengers as they realized someone in authority was about to handle the situation. The woman spotted the officers and stiffened, hugging her carry-on to her chest. "What is this?" she hissed. "Why are there cops here?" An airline representative, who must have boarded as soon as the door opened, spoke in a measured tone. "Ma'am, we receive reports of disruptive behavior. We need you to step off the aircraft and speak with these officers." She shook her head so violently that her hat nearly fell off. "You can't do this to me. I've done nothing wrong. It's that woman in first class. She stole my seat. Don't arrest me for pointing out an injustice." The officers exchanged glances. One approached calmly. "Ma'am, we just want to talk. Let's do this in the terminal." She tried to argue further, but the flight attendants and the officers gently guided her off the plane. The rest of us remained seated, hearts still pounding, as the flight attendants announced we would disembark once the situation was fully cleared in the jet bridge. At last, we were given the green light to exit. A wave of relief, mixed with nervous excitement, washed over us. As I gathered my carry-on, the silver-haired couple behind me patted my shoulder. "Well done, dear," one of them said softly. "You stood your ground. She had no business treating you like that." I smiled gratefully. "Thank you. I was just trying to keep my composure." "Sometimes that's enough," the man chimed in. "We've traveled many places, and trust us, it takes all kinds. People like her always get a reality check eventually." I stepped into the aisle, noticing the open overhead compartment where that woman's bag had been. It was gone, no doubt taken by the officers, or perhaps to the baggage claim under her watchful eye. Taking a steady breath, I made my way down the jet bridge toward the terminal. At first, I saw no sign of her. Then, as I reached the main walkway, I spotted her near a window, flanked by the 2 officers and an airline employee. Her arms were crossed, defiance radiating from her posture. But I also caught a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, as if she was no longer sure that aggression would solve everything. The bubble of entitlement had popped. I didn't linger to watch the confrontation. People like that rarely change if they think the world is always out to get them. But maybe, just maybe, she'd think twice before assuming everyone owed her. As for me, I had a connecting flight to catch to get to Vancouver. My heart was still pounding, but I felt unexpectedly proud of myself for not capitulating. On the short walk between gates, I considered everything that had happened. It was a bizarre, tense ordeal, but it reminded me of something important. We often shrink ourselves to avoid conflict. Yet sometimes it's necessary to assert our boundaries, to say, no, this is mine, I earned it. No one can steal your worth, I told myself, not even someone with the loudest voice in the room. After navigating the terminal, I found my connection and boarded without incident. In my new seat, an aisle seat this time, still nice but not first class, I closed my eyes and let out a long exhale. My son had texted that morning, promising to pick me up from the airport. All at once, the tension in my body began to melt, replaced by cautious optimism for whatever conversation awaited us. I pictured us standing by the arrival's gate, maybe sharing an awkward hug that would hopefully turn genuine. I thought of the old pictures of us laughing in the backyard, or the times he confided in me when he was just a boy. In a few hours, I'd see him face to face. The memory of the Karen fiasco lingered in the corners of my mind like distant thunder. One of those surreal experiences you recount later to friends who can't believe it actually happened. But for now, I took it as a small lesson about life and entitlement. And with that final reflective thought, I allowed myself to drift into a calmer headspace, ready to embrace whatever came next. When the plane finally touched down in Vancouver, the crisp air and the promise of a long overdue family reunion overshadowed the earlier chaos. Perhaps it was the best kind of reality check, that no tantrum, no outburst can truly derail you when you remember why you're traveling in the first place. To find something worth holding on to, be it family, a sense of personal achievement, or the simple peace of having stood your ground. I stepped off into the cool Vancouver air, shoulders squared, heart open. Far behind me, the Meltdown was still echoing in some corner of the airport. But in my world, it was a closed chapter, one that had reaffirmed my strength, my patience, and my faith that, in the end, life has a way of balancing out. Entitlement might scream and shout, but it can't silence the quiet determination of someone who knows their own worth. And maybe, just maybe, that's the ultimate reality check we all could use. The end.